Everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's TeTra seminar. Our speaker is Mateusz Kusio. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at KU Leuven, and he has a broad interest in early Christian literature and has previously worked on Antichrist traditions in Judaism and Christianity. His edition of Commodianus will be published by AUP this year, so we are very fortunate to hear from him just ahead of the publication and to get a first glimpse of this obscure yet fascinating poet. Mateusz, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Mariam, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to the series, which I have observed for a long time and from which I have learned so much over the years. I would like to share my screen now. And I will make it full screen. If you can see that, is that all right?
Perfect.
Great. So today I will be speaking on a topic that is, in a sense, doubly obscure, because on the one hand, I will speak about an obscure poet, that is Commodianus. I imagine that name doesn't say much to many, but I will obviously spend some time introducing this figure. And it's another layer of obscurity is the fact that we have so little of the manuscript tradition and reception on Commodianus. But I think if we look long enough at it, as I will try to do today, this will make more sense and will become less obscure. I'm in Leuven with a new project, but here on the first slide, you have all the institutions that have thrown money at this project at some point in the past. And the edition will hopefully come out at the end of this year. But still, I'm at the end of the production of the manuscript. So if you have any questions, then please do ask them, because that could still change something in my thinking. Okay, let me start with introducing Commodianus. As I said before, Commodianus is probably the earliest Christian poet known by name, and that is his claim to fame. He is the first Christian poet that we have works from surviving until our own day with his name on them. Obviously, we have earlier Christian poetry. We do have Sibylline oracles, parts of them. We have the Odes of Solomon. We do have metric inscriptions that are Christian from 2nd century. You could even say that we have bits of the New Testament that are hymnic, if you agree with that assessment. But as far as a Christian poet is concerned, we don't go further than Commodianus, and he takes us back to mid-3rd century Roman North Africa. Some have claimed later dates, especially 5th century can still be seen sometimes in scholarship, but I think this is much less likely, and that I think is an assessment of most of people that deal with Commodianus. He is most likely a figure of the mid-3rd century interestingly of the mid-3rd century crisis as well, and he was active most likely for at least part of his life in Roman North Africa, and the works that I will be discussing today come from Roman North Africa. That is primarily because of some cultural clues mentioned across these works, and also due to his Commodianus's reliance on Cyprian. But he might have been a traveling figure. I do make a claim in my edition that he might have been a soldier. He might have traveled further afield and then settled in Roman North Africa, but that's open to debate. We don't know much about him. We actually know very, very little about him. One thing that we do know about him, because he tells us so repeatedly, is that he's a convert from paganism. He repeatedly references his previous era, and he admonishes his audiences to turn from their own era and follow him. In the final poem of his collection of acrostics, the Instructiones, he introduces himself in the acrostic as Commodianus Mendicus Christi Nomen Gazei. And 2 points of interest here in this obscure reference. Mendicus obviously means beggar of some sort. Some have claimed, especially those that propose a later date, consider this to be somebody that actually is called Mendicus by the broader community, and it will have sort of larger, more specific significance. I don't think this is the case in Commodianus. He simply considers himself to be a poor person, whatever that means. And also, relatedly, what does Gazei, or the basic form would probably be Gazeus, means? Some people would claim that this is an orthonym coming from Gaza. That is, I don't think, very likely. That would mean most likely that that Commodianus is a Greek speaker, because all of the inscriptions that we have from Gaza from that time are Greek speaking. I don't think he is a Greek speaker, and I think he's almost certainly a Latin native speaker, because his poetry is bad enough for that. I think that this is also a claim that has been already made in scholarship, that this name derives from actually from Greek, but also Latin, from Gaza, or in Latin Gaza, meaning treasury. And that would mean that he's somehow responsible for the communal finances or the church finances, which would actually be relevant to some of the criticisms and arguments that he makes in his works, and some of them are actually quite class conscious. We have 2 surviving works from him. I already mentioned the Instructiones. Those are 80 acrostic poems. Acrostics obviously are those poems in which, where you take the first word of each verse, you will come up with a word or a phrase or an entire sentence. They are directed to pagans, Jews, and Christians. He picks a fight with absolutely everybody. One single important manuscript in the Staatsbibliothek. I will go into detail on this manuscript later on. The first edition comes from mid-17th century, and this has been edited a couple of times in most of the major series. But I think there is still a need for a re-edition. And the second work is Carmen. You will most likely have heard about it as Carmen Apologeticum or Carmen de Duobus Populis. The work itself in the manuscript is not titled. So I think Carmen is the most minimal and the most obvious title that we can stick to. Anything beyond that is interpretation. It's a didactic poem in hexameters, over 1,000 of those. Instructiones are also hexameters, although as we can see, as we will be able to see, the Latin is quite bad and the meter doesn't exactly work. And Carmen is a work, I will also speak about that more, of more serious theology, not simply admonishment, but also to some extent speculation on theology and eschatology, and also quite a bit of scriptural exegesis that is primarily dependent on Cyprian's testimonia. A single manuscript in the British Library, again, I will talk about that in a moment, and several significant editions, most importantly, the Editio Princeps, that comes from much later than that of Instructiones, from mid-19th century by Jean-Baptiste Pitra. We have very little about Commodianus from outside of him. We have a note by Gennadius of Massilia in the Viridus Illustribus, that is continuation of Jerome's work under the same title from late 5th century. We have a note in the Decretum Galasianum, a papal decree or a quasi-papal decree that purports itself to be issued by Pope Gelasius in the first half of the 6th century. And then we have a very short note about Commodianus in the medieval Honorius of Autun, that is an extract from Gennadius. And this attestation I will turn to first, and the only really meaningful discussion of Commodianus that we get in antiquity or anywhere in before 17th century is in Gennadius. and I will just read to you the English, which is my own translation. Commodianus, when he studied the works of secular literature, studied also those of ours, and at an opportune time accepted the opportunity for faith. So having become a Christian and wanting to make of his studies a gift to Christ, the cause of his salvation, he wrote against the pagans, or a work against the pagans. It can be a description rather than a title, in mediocre language and quasi-poetic form, mediocre sermone quasi verso. Since he was very familiar with our literature, he was better suited to destroy what is theirs, that is pagans, than to strengthen what is ours. Hence, when he fought against them with regard to divine assurances, he argued in a style which was rather cheap and, so to speak, coarse, arousing astonishment on their part and despair on ours, following the authors Tertullian, Lactantius, and Papias. Still, he made an excellent commitment to moral teaching, especially to the love of voluntary poverty, and inculcated it in his students. Several points of interest here. The most important thing that Commodianus is problematic for, according to Gennadius, is his style. His lack of learning and lack of literary knowledge and lack of polished Latin, and that is actually a fair assessment. We'll see that later on. Another aspect is that Commodianus is considered to be a convert, which is most likely correct. He's associated with authors such as Tertullian, Lactantius, and Papias, and there is one thread going through these three authors, and that is millenarianism, and that is Chiliasm, as the belief that there will be a seventh millennium of peace before the final judgment. And that, to some extent, does shine through in Commodianus. He is a Chiliast, although only in the Instructiones and not in the Carmen, really. Gennadius most likely makes up the claim that Commodianus had students. There is nothing to suggest that in Commodianus himself. But the mention of voluntary poverty is grounded in Commodianus's works, and might be a fair assessment. Moving to the Cretum Galatianum, the mention is very brief, but interesting nonetheless. Opuscula Commodiani Apocrypha, the works of Commodianus, are apocryphal. Apocryphal most likely meaning not biblical but not canonical, but rather apocryphal in the sense that they are heterodox in some way, because that's how the Cretum Galatianum uses this word. But it's clear, and this is a text that gets copied in the Middle Ages. It's not an unknown text. So it's important to understand that if Commodianus would be known in the Middle Ages, then he would be most likely known as an author with poor Latin and of works that are apocryphal or spurious or not fully accepted. And I think this assessment shines through in those moments of manuscript tradition that we'll see in a moment. So as I've said, we have very little of kind of outside reception, outside attestation of Commodianus, so we have to turn to the little of the manuscript tradition that we have. I will first talk about the Manuscript of the Instructiones and then about the Manuscript of the Carmen. That is slightly reversed because I do think that Carmen is actually an earlier work, but this is immaterial to my point here. The first manuscript of the Manuscript of Instructiones is kept in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, MS Phillips, 1825. 9th century Carolingian minuscule parchment, copied most likely in Verona, although some have claimed Angers in France, but I do think this is a North Italian manuscript. Small format. I don't exactly remember the size, the dimensions, but it's essentially reads like a small notebook. In the contents are important. The codex starts with Commodianus, then moves on to Prudentius's Tituli Historiarum, also known as the Didochaion, short poems to illustrate biblical scenes. Then we have a much later author, I think 8th century Aldhelm, Carmina Ecclesiastica, similar to Prudentius. Then we have a series of riddles known as Enigmata Tulli or the Bern riddles, a poem by Eugene of Toledo, and then 4 anonymous poems at the end of the codex. The codex is generally copied in one hand, although the beginning itself is written in a different hand. It was previously bound with MS Phillips 1727, which contains, also in the Staatsbibliothek, it contains Sedulius's Opus Paschale, which is a prose reworking of Sedulius's more famous Carmen Paschale, and is actually the first attestation of the earliest attestation of this work. We do have 2 17th century copies of this manuscript, one in Leiden and one in Paris. They are copied from an lost copy by Jacques Sirmont in early 17th century. They do exist, and I did consult them, but they do not provide new readings in a significant way. What is important on the picture that you can see on your right is especially the title. And you can see, maybe I should have enlarged it, sorry, but it reads Incipit Commodiani Instructiones per litteras versum primas, so the beginning of Commodian's instructions. I would say arranged by the first letter of each verse. And then you have the sort of contents list of a list of titles of each poem, which also is the list of acrostics. In each poem of the first book, there is also a contents list for the second book. And it's important that each of the titles is actually the acrostic of that poem, for few exceptions. But you can immediately see that the scribe did understand that this is that the fundamental quality of this poetry is acrostics, is that it's acrostics. This, I think, quite significant for understanding how the scribe understood Commodianus. This is also borne out by the mise en page of the text. On the left, you have the first page of the text itself. You have a quite ornate initial, and then you can see, especially in the second poem, Indignatio Dei, you have the title, and then if you look down, immediately you see that the capitalized letter of each verse, capitalized letters of each verse would give you the same phrase, Indignatio Dei. And the capitalization, that's not exactly surprising for a manuscript of this period. This capitalization happens only in the first letter of each verse. So it's clear that the scribe understood that those are acrostics and tried to make the reader aware of that. And this is also visible in the poem kind of that I've zoomed in on. On the right, this is the 9th poem, the collection on, as you can see, Mercurius, on Mercury. You have the Latin there from my edition, but I will read you the English in my translation again. Your Mercury should be depicted with a purse, ad ballo, a rare word, a helmet and a cloak, winged, but otherwise nude. I see a wondrous thing, a god flying with a sack. Run, you poor things, with your laps open as he flies and empties his sack. Be ready for that. Look at his image, because he will rain coins from on high. Then you will dance carefree. You fool, are you not stupid to worship a god painted on a board? If you don't know how to live, then go loiter with the beasts. The Latin, as you can see, is quite a dire at times. The meter isn't exactly hexameter, or doesn't stick to the rules of hexameter, strictly speaking. But there is, I think, a imaginative quality to the text, especially in its description of what Commodianus understands as pagan worship, and the claim that pagans mistake images for real life, and there is a sort of comedic effect because they await Mercury they wait for Mercury to rain coins while Mercury is just painted. Moving on to the Manuscript of the Carmen. This is an earlier manuscript from 8th century. In a single hand, the entire codex is in a single hand, in a pre-Carolingian minuscule, on parchment, almost certainly from Anatolia in northern Italy. The contents, again, are important. We get a lot of Augustine in the whole codex, a bit of Jerome, and then at the very end, with neither title nor the name of the author, we get the Carmen by Commodianus. So you could possibly claim that this is not the same author as the Instructiones, but this claim that it is by the same author as the Instructiones was made by TeTra in the Editio Princeps, and that hasn't been challenged. And I don't think you could possibly challenge that. It is absolutely standard now to claim that, and I think it's simply correct. If you look at the page, you see that there is some indentation, but the indentation stops at the bottom of the first page. You do get the ornate initial. The hand is obviously earlier than in the Instructiones. And this is the mise en page is again important because although this is clearly poetry, and a reader would understand this is poetry because the rhythm would quite clearly indicate it. But if we look further into the codex, then at some point it just looks like prose. It looks indeed like other works in this codex, and this being the very last work in the codex, the final page of the Carmen is also the final page of the codex, which means that it's on the right. It's badly it's badly damaged, so it's barely readable. I think the text can be established, but parts of it are, especially on the top, are completely lost. But we do think that this is actually the ending of the text, because at the bottom you can't read this, but so you have to take my word for it. At the very bottom of the page, you could see possibly explicit Tractatus Sancti Episcopi. So the end of the treatise by a Saint Bishop, by holy bishop. And that is almost certainly false. That's almost certainly made up in the sense that Commodianus was not a bishop. There is nothing in the work to indicate that. There is nothing that suggests that he ever enjoyed episcopal status. Indeed, he was critical of bishops. So I think this is a attempt to elevate his status. Just briefly, as I said before, Commodianus, so the Carmen of Commodianus is a work of more serious theologizing. It's not apology like we see in the Instructiones. It's much more focused on explaining Christian teaching along with scriptural exegesis and especially eschatology. And what is very important is that Carmen is one of very, very few texts that allows us access into modalism or Sabellianism or patripationism, as some call it. Obviously, these labels are distinct, but they're quite related. And in this case, Commodianus is somebody that thinks that the early Trinitarian description of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, that's not exactly true. Those are names, but beyond that, there is just a single deity. There is a single God. And that is visible in the passages that I have, the first 3 passages that I have put on the slide. I will just read you the English. He, known only to himself, was placed in the Word. He who is called, Digitur, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then, quite stunningly, he had come, born of our blood. That's a Virgilian reflex there, to appear human, but it was God hiding in flesh. So to Commodianus, Jesus isn't really a human. He's simply God clothed in flesh. But there is no human nature there. God is simply hiding in the sort of human outward appearance. Then whoever believes in the three and understands there to be one, this person will live forever and be reborn into the everlasting world. So again, we see that Commodianus in this kind of very early Trinitarian discussions of the mid-3rd century would take the position that God is simply one, and there are just 3 modes of existence of the divine being. In terms of eschatology, the work is also quite adventurous. I will just quote a passage from close to the end of the work. The figure from Persia claims himself to be immortal. Nero, there is a legend of Nero Redivivus there, became the Antichrist for us, this one for the Jews. The 2 will be the prophets for all of the end time. Nero will be the ruin of the city of Rome, this one of the whole earth, about which I offer but a few words which I have read in secret. And that's quite interesting, because Commodianus reveals that he read something that most likely is not intended or available to public consumption. And then he actually very soon after this claim goes on to discuss the return of the 12 tribes of Israel, of the lost tribes of Israel, sorry, from beyond the Euphrates. And this is a very unique feature of Christian apocalyptic. There is very little attestation of that, but the attestation that we have actually comes from Jewish sources for Ezra and a post-Talmudic apocalypse, the signs of the Messiah, Atot HaMashiach. And there we do actually have interest in the return of the tribes. But among Christian authors, Commodianus is very, very, very unique in this regard. So it's clear that Carmen could be perceived as a rather adventurous text, to say the least, perhaps quite suspect to later readers. So coming to conclusions, I would claim that in Instructiones are received primarily as a sort of playful literary text. The Latin is easy, and this is marked out by the sustained use of acrostics, and this was noticed by the scribe, as you could see on the pages of the Berlin Codex. The codicological context, so that the works that accompany the Instructiones, is that of less circulated, briefer, shorter verse works of late and ancient and early medieval Latin writers. We do get shorter poems by Prudentius. We get riddles, the Bern riddles, a couple of unattested poems. So generally speaking, the Instructiones are perceived as, I think that's what the manuscript tradition indicates. It's a work that is primarily perceived because it's acrostic in nature. And it's accompanied by other late ancient, sort of later Latin ecclesiastical works. The orthodoxy, whatever that means, of the work, it does not seem problematic to describe, and the text bears out the name of the author. It is orthonymous. It does have the name Commodianus on top of it, because it would not be considered a work of serious theology. It would not be considered a work of that would approach a stature of doctrinal work, but it's instead thought about as an interesting literary curiosity. And you have to remember that obviously we do have acrostics in ancient literature. We have them already in the Hebrew Bible as abecedarians. We do get metric inscriptions with names of people commissioning or writing these inscriptions with written out in the acrostic. We do have a tendency among classic scholars today that to chase the acrostics, short words on the margins in the first letters of Virgil or Ovid or Horace. But Commodianus is to some extent the first author that makes acrostics into something so fundamental to his literary project, and all of his writings in the Instructiones are acrostic. So that's, I think, quite significant also for the medieval scribe. On the other hand, the Carmen, as I said, a work that is more serious and more daring in its theology, that is appended at the end of a collection of writings of Augustine and Jerome. In a sense, it leans, I think, on their status, on their prestige, on their orthodoxy. Interestingly, they are named repeatedly across this codex. So every work by Augustine and Jerome, it has an incipit, it has an explicit, they are named repeatedly. There is no question who this work is about. With Commodianus, with the Carmen, there is a question because the work doesn't have a title, doesn't have a name of the author, in a sense, possibly to prevent associating that with a criticism like that we've seen in the Decretum Galasianum. And the end of the code, the end of the Carmen is, as I said, contains the explicit that artificially elevates Commodianus to the authority of a bishop, and therefore makes the text slightly more authoritative and more kind of safe to read, so to say. The mise en page also is only initially that of a poem, and it moves on to look much like a prose work. Again, there might be other considerations there, like, for example, saving the parchment. But I think this is not completely accidental. The work reads much more like other works in this codex. So again, I think, to conclude, the scribes of these two works were attuned to what was in those works. They understood what was going on. And it's possible that they did think about the reception of these texts, in the sense that they thought about who's going to read these texts that they copied, so that Instructiones would continue to be received as a sort of interesting literary text, a curiosity, as I said, and Carmen would be sort of safely hidden away, preserved but hidden away, along with sort of more serious theological works, more serious, again, works of authors whose orthodoxy was unimpeachable. And in both cases, they accentuate these qualities of these texts in the way they actually copy them. So I think this exercise is in that sense fruitful, that because we have so little of both the outsider attestation and of the manuscript tradition, this exercise in material philology was is so necessary, because it allows us to see how people actually have read this very obscure poet about whom we know very little, and it actually shows us how these works were thought of vis-a-vis also kind of ecclesiastical pronouncements of authors like Gennadius and the author of the Decretum Galasianum. That will be all. Thank you so much, and I await your questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper, and for introducing us to this author and the transmission of his works. It's extremely interesting. We're opening now the floor to questions and conversations. I think Andy has a first question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mateusz. It's an introduction into a very interesting author I knew nothing about. I'm just curious. It's a question out of complete ignorance, because it's not. I just wanted to ask some clarification about this attribution of this Carmen, the second text. How do you know that it is by him? Because there is no attribution in the manuscripts. So how can you tell? Because I also noticed Gennadius only mentions. Well, I assume he's referring to the other text. So how do we know?
So the language is very, very similar. There are verbal borrowings from one work to the other. There is almost complete sort of ideological agreement. So the kind of theology that he propounds in both works is very, very similar. So once this has been claimed by TeTra in 1825, 52, that hasn't been argued anew, and it hasn't been challenged, because once you read these two works sort of side by side, they look incredibly similar in terms of just the language that we have in Commodianus. As far as Gennadius is concerned, there is a little bit of discussion about what he knew about Commodianus. I don't think he knew much. What work he specifically refers to, that's also a question about how you exactly read this Adversus Paganus passage, the bit in his bio, because it could be a work against the pagans, and it most likely would be the Instructiones, but that's not completely sure. People have had discussions about that. And just a sort of footnote there, the fact that we only have very late reception of Commodianus, so Jerome doesn't know about him, and he's only mentioned by Gennadius and by Decretum Galasianum. This is the strongest argument out there for a late dating, for 5th century dating. Although I don't think it actually works in the end, because Gennadius doesn't, he can be confused about works that come out of Roman North Africa. So for example, he misattributes the Baptismata, which we know is Pseudo-Cyprianic, but it's not claimed as such by Gennadius. So I don't think we have to take his word for it, but it's nonetheless an important, as much as we get about of his outside attestation. But again, the Carmen is almost certainly, there is like 99% chance that this is by the same author because the language is so similar.
And did I get it right? Did you say that it's not great language? Is that, or have I misunderstood? So
No,
that's one of the reasons
you're right.
no one else would write that terribly. That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah, so the phraseology is very similar, and
Yeah.
you could claim that the meter is treated very similarly. So it's it's a very particular kind of Latin, and that's, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of Commodianus, the Latin that he uses. But and again, this is very difficult to imitate, and it's very difficult to attribute to. It would be very difficult to attribute to somebody that's not a native Latin speaker. I think it's quite difficult to conceive of somebody learning that kind of Latin. It's possible, I don't discount that completely, and he might have had some Greek, but I think that we're dealing with not a native speaker.
Okay, thanks very much.
Very interesting. The next question comes from Georgia, and then Sophia, and then Marion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Mateusz, for guiding us through this fascinating and, well, it was obscure to me, manuscript edition and author. I actually have 2 questions in one, but they are more or less related, and that is about reception and audience. So I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about the audience that Commodianus is maybe addressing. So if you have any idea of that, and also if you have any hypothesis on the manuscript themselves, because if I heard you correctly, you said that you think that the first manuscript, the one that is Stadtbibliothek, is maybe written in Italy, northern Italy, and I was wondering whether that's because of the handwriting or because of the kind of content. So if you have a possible idea on why the manuscript with this peculiar material was produced.
So on the question of, just start with the manuscripts, the origin is that's been established mostly by people smarter than me and by paleographers. They see that the handwriting is quite similar, and it's very, especially with the Carmen, it's very similar to what we have else from scriptoria in Donatola. The fact that these 2 works would be from Verona, from northern Italy, if you accept that the Instructiones was copied in Verona, is significant. It's possibly significant, but I don't know what to make of it. It just that there is a limited reception in the early Middle Ages. That's interesting, but I don't exactly know how to deal with that, because there is a gap of a couple of centuries between Gennadius and these manuscripts, so we don't know anything about what's going on between. These manuscripts obviously are not copied out of the autographs. There must have been some sort of transmission history in between. How much of that happened in between, we don't know. And your first question.
The audience. So
the audience.
Yeah.
As I said, the audience is most visible in the Instructiones, because there are poems where Commodianus at least pretends that he's addressing a specific group. He's talking to the deacons, he's talking to the presbyters, he's talking to the lectors, he's talking to women. There are 2 poems directed to women with kind of usual content primarily against makeup. He talks to the Jews. He talks to, interestingly, he talks about at the beginning, he talks about, he addresses pagan worshippers of different deities, like Mithras, for example. To what extent that is a real audience, it's very difficult to tell. He at least thought that this might have been might affect the community. And I think that especially the second book of the Instructiones, there might have been an actual audience intended, because Commodianus most likely was somehow attached to a church, somehow as somebody in charge of the communal purse. I think that's the most reasonable reading of that final acrostic, Commodianus Mendicus Christi Nomen Gazei. But again, how much he was read, most likely very little. There are obviously arguments relating to who might have read Commodianus but didn't mention him. And a most significant two authors that might have done that was Victorinus of Petau, of Petavia, the author of the first commentary on Revelation in the Latin West, and then Lactantius. Because if you read the eschatological bits of Instructiones and Carmen side by side with the seventh book of the Divine Institutes, you will get quite a bit of overlap. And you could even claim that Lactantius is reading Commodianus, taking ideas out of him, but making them more palatable to a broader audience, especially Roman audience. Because, for example, Commodianus is quite anti-Roman. You can't really say that to that extent about Lactantius. So the audience is, it's clearly in view in the sense that Commodianus says who he's addressing that to, but he's not, it's very unclear whether this ever reached the actual addressees. In the case of Carmen, this is very difficult to ascertain because the text doesn't speak to somebody. It talks about the Jews, especially. It talks about the pagans to some extent, but those aren't intended audiences exactly. So the audience is much less in view in that text. In the Instructiones, it is in view, but again, as I said, it's not clear who would have read it in actuality.
Thank you.
I believe Sophia is next.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mateusz, for your talk. And I would like to continue Georgia's question about audience, but more like from the perspective of the use of those poems. Like I'm thinking in terms of liturgical and paraliturgical use. Is it possible from your perspective?
Impossible, I think. Sorry to be so clear about that, but this is, I can't imagine this being used liturgically. Indeed.
Paraliturgically?
Sorry?
I mean, paraliturgically then? Outside the service by the community as like a call songs or on the feasts or whatever it might be?
That would be difficult.
Okay.
There is one possible argument in favor of that. It's because the meter is so simple and it's not exactly hexameter any longer. It's maybe a broken hexameter or a version of hexameter, but it's not exactly hexameter the way you have it in classical poetry. You could claim that this is an early version of Christian popular poetry, something that we have claimed for Arius. Athanasius says that Arius did write these songs that were meant to be, known even to working people. And on the other hand, you have Augustine and Psalm against the Donatists, which is also, again, not a hexameter really. It's a much more rhythmic poem, and that's meant to have a popular audience. And Augustine admits as much in the Retractationes, but that's very circumstantial. I don't see these kinds of texts being used seriously in a popular setting or in a communal setting. I think, well, an interesting point here is also the fact that those are acrostics. Acrostics only really work if you look at them. Maybe I'm facetious here, but you have to look at the page to be able to make it out. I might be wrong on this again, but I think that this, to some extent, assumes a audience with a text in front of them. So that's actually, I haven't really thought that through completely, because that's a very it's a hypothetical who would have read it, but it's important that this is to some extent visual poetry. So that, I think, moves it slightly further away from this kind of communal or hymnic use that you speak about.
Okay.
Emanuela, please.
Yes, thank you, Mateusz. It was really very illuminating. And let me see if I can formulate the question, because this comes really out of ignorance. You know, I don't really work, I know very little about Western Latin traditions. So we have here a relatively obscure author, and we have a work especially referring to the Carmen that has not been copied a lot, but has been extremely influential when it comes especially to eschatological ideas, and was read by Lactantius and Victorinus. So I'm a bit curious about this reception history at his time. If you understand the question, you know.
Yes. It's a difficult question in the sense that to some extent, this is very much in the eye of the beholder. You could claim that, for example, in the case of Lactantius, you could claim, oh, this is taken from Commodianus, but you could say, oh, this is just a sort of organic development, organic exegetical development out of revelation. Or you have this kind of endless argument, oh, there is a common tradition or a common source, and they all refer to it or derive from it indirectly. I think it might have had its readers back in the day around the middle 3rd century, because it's if you want to have kind of adventurous eschatology in the Latin West in the 3rd century, Tertullian isn't going to be much help. Cyprian isn't going to be much help. Where do you look? Let's say in the late 3rd century, where do you look for something like that? I think that Commodianus would come in handy to authors like Victorinus and especially Lactantius. With Victorinus, it's not exactly clear who borrows from whom. I think that they might have simply met at some point. They might have read each other's work. I don't claim that there is one unidirectional borrowing one to the other. Also, it depends how you exactly date Victorinus, how you exactly date Commodianus. It's interesting that I haven't talked about that, but these manuscripts don't really have any marginal notes, any glosses. But there is one moment towards the end of the Carmen where there is a note which has unfortunately been cut when the pages were trimmed at some point. And there are just a couple of letters, but one of the most important editors of Commodianus, Bernhard Dombart, in the 19th century, read this note as, here there is discussion about, I don't remember the Latin exactly, here is there discussion about the Roman Senate being persecuted. And that's actually, that clearly refers to what is going on in Commodianus's text, that there is a moment when the barbarians come over across the Danube, most likely Goths, come over from across the Danube and enslave the Roman Senate. So one moment in the entire manuscript tradition where we do have a note from a reader or from a copyist, I don't remember whether it's exactly the same hand or not. One moment of when we have this kind of note refers to the eschatology, where it refers to a very peculiar moment of eschatology when you have the defeat of Rome, not a complete defeat of Rome, because that is before Nero comes over, but there is a quite interesting moment in Commodianus' eschatology, and that actually must have made at least one reader wonder what this is about, enough to put a note on the margin, to focus their attention, his and other readers, on that particular passage. So the eschatology definitely was the most interesting aspect of this text, and I'm not surprised that people like Lactantius would be interested in that. But Lactantius doesn't mention anything nearly as open that to allow a kind of secure connection to be established.
Okay, thank you.
Marion, please.
Thank you, Mateusz, for a wonderful paper. You presented Commodianus as a bad poet, or at best a mediocre one, both in the view of Gennadius, but also seemingly in the evaluation of modern scholars, like yourself. So I wondered, would the late antique scribes who transmitted his texts, would they have agreed that they were transmitting a low quality work? And if so, why would they have been interested in doing so? Would they have had any awareness that this was a particularly ancient text? And secondly, perhaps related to that, if I understood you correctly, the instructions were transmitted in a manuscript together also with a set of riddles.
Mm-hmm.
Could that perhaps also suggest a context of fun, of being intellectual, but also perhaps some kind of entertainment?
Yes. It's always a question about to what extent the scribe knows Latin well, and to what extent, that's even less probable, they know Latin poetry in general. With the Instructiones, there is clearly a perception, I think, that this is a work that's not really classical. It's obviously Christian, because then you have Prudentius, you have Aldhelm, you have Eugene of Toledo later. And that belongs to what we would call a post-classical age. Yeah, Silver Latin, late Latin, whatever you want to call it. So there, the kind of stylistic assessment comes into play. With Carmen, it's much more difficult to establish, because the catechological context, I think, focuses on the kind of, let's call it doctrinal or theological content of the work, because you get Augustine and Jerome earlier on in the Codex. So I think to come back to the knowledge of the knowledge of Latin of the scribes, especially in the Instructiones, the scribe is pretty faithful, I think, but he sometimes doesn't know what he's doing. So sometimes the reading is completely gibberish. It's completely garbled. You can't make heads or tails of it, and then you just have to suppose something. You have to make an amendation. But in the Carmen, it's less frequent. I think the scribe is better trained. The hand is better, and there are less of these kind of these cruces where you simply don't know what to do with the reading. Your second question. I'm sorry, I'm bad with second questions today.
No problem at all. No, I was just curious about the context of these
Yeah.
riddles, possibly together with poems and didactic contexts.
Yes, so I think it's in the case of Instructiones, it's very much a case of fun, of literary playfulness, of literary curiosity. I think Instructiones might not have been preserved if they were not acrostics. I think this is very much a quality that shines through the mise en page, and because it's so interesting, because it's also so rare. Yeah, it's so rare in the sense that we don't have many classical texts like that. Definitely not ones that would be copied in the Middle Ages. So I think that as for the riddles, yes, I think they contribute to that. They are enigmatic, and they have a quality to them that requires an interaction from the reader. So that's although if you look at them in the manuscript, they are to some extent didactic, because they work in the sense like old riddles, I am this, this, and this, what am I? But that is given in the text, and the title is immediately the answer. So first thing you see is the answer, and then you see the actual riddle. So I think that there might be a didactic context for them. For Instructiones, I'm not sure, but yes, I think that kind of literary playfulness is all the way through this manuscript.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Helen, please.
Hi, Mateusz. Nice to finally meet you in person, albeit digitally. I was wondering, with the manuscript tradition, as you and I know, Commodian has a lot of neologisms, sorry, my pronunciation. How did the scribes work with these? And is there anything in the other texts that are included with these works that would tell us how they're working with Commodian's neologisms?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't thought about that. There are neologisms, so there are hapax legomena that we don't. There are multiple words that we don't know from anywhere else. Usually, they are formed in a way that is pretty common for late Latin. So most of these words are understandable. Sometimes, quite interestingly, and I was always surprised by how often I would have to go back to early Latin, to Plautus, to Terence, because it's actually quite interesting that these all words that are preserved in lexica, late ancient lexica. Sometimes the scribe doesn't know how to do that, but sometimes, especially in the Instructiones, the scribe just preserves it as is. So, for example, in the poem that I have given you on Mercury, there are a couple of these rare words, and then there is the scribe wrote things that are kind of meaningless. So that then you would have to do the philology in order to try to uncover what is actually meant. I'm not sure how much of the other manuscripts, the other texts in the codex would be helpful in understanding that. I haven't thought about that really, so that's a good question. I would have to chase the neologisms in Prudentius and Adel and Eugene of Toledo to see, and in the Bern riddles to see whether they actually the scribes manage that or not. But that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it. Thank you.
There is a question in the chat from Håkon. Thank you for your lecture. A small question regarding Carmina 932-36. Is there an agreement? Go ahead.
No, there is no agreement. There have not really been proposals on that. The fact that there is a figure coming from the east, that's not exactly surprising, given that we are talking about possibly, 250s and the war with Sapper. I have toyed with the idea. I eventually rejected that, but I toyed with the idea that this is a figure known to us primarily from the 13th Sibylline oracle called Mariades, who was a decurio in Antioch, and he cooperated with the Persians once they took over in, I think, 256. And there is some possible overlap there, and Commodianus, that wouldn't be so surprising that he would reference that. But ultimately, I think this is too speculative, even for me. So I would reject that, as in I do mention that in the commentary, but I don't agree with that. I don't incorporate it as part of my reconstruction. So I don't think that Commodianus would try to identify that figure with anybody, with a name and a kind of historical identity. That is also a question for Nero. Is Nero really Decius? And then Commodianus actually speaks about Nero having two co-emperors, and there is a whole discussion about, oh, are these, this imperial sons of the emperor or somebody else? And then there is an endless identification. I don't think Commodianus would go into that. Having three evil figures is a common apocalyptic trope. It doesn't have to be any specific figure to make sense. And indeed, the work achieves a kind of trans-historical quality if you don't exactly identify it or don't make it very obvious who that might be. So I know there haven't been any on the figure of from Persia. There hasn't been any concrete identification, and I don't think there is one.
There's still a couple of questions, so maybe we can keep them short. Andy, then Georgia, then myself.
Thanks. A very short question. I seem to remember that at the start you this is about Commodianus's biography. I think you mentioned at the start that you said something that you thought he might have a military background.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just briefly just a few words say why do you think that might be the case?
Yes, I think first of all there is a little bit of what looks like military slang in Commodianus. So there are a couple of words that are very rarely attested outside of military settings, and definitely not in poetry. So that's one thing. I think that there are, apart from Roman North Africa, which I think is the primary setting, but the most important setting when he was active, there are two other settings where he could have been active or seen something or been present in. One is Syria. There are some references to Eastern cults or something like that in Commodianus. And importantly, I think he knows the Didascalia Apostolorum, quite interestingly. He knows that text, at least to some extent. And that is also a question of language. I'll skip that. But he might have been in Syria for a second, and he might have been in Pannonia, because he references a name, Amodates. Amodates is a name for the divinity Elagabalus. And that name, Amodates, survives only in one inscription from Pannonia, from 240s, in Brigetio, in the camp that was settled by the First Legion. And I think I make this claim in a tentative claim in the commentary. He might have been a soldier in the First Legion, because First Legion was in Syria in 243 to 44 under Gordian III, then moved back to Pannonia, and then he might have been a veteran that just settled in North Africa. This is a wild speculation, and I admit that, and I might be wrong on all these three places, but I think that this is a way to kind of make sense of the evidence.
I believe Georgia has probably the last question.
Yeah, thank you. It's again a question out of ignorance and curiosity. I was just wondering whether you could tell us in a few words if there is something special, something peculiar about Commodianus' anti-pagan or anti-Jewish rhetoric polemic.
So with anti-pagan rhetoric, that's pretty much what you would get in Tertullian, what you would get in Arnobius, what you would get in Lactantius, what you would get eventually in Augustine, in the Quidata. So that's not that interesting, so to say. Although there are sort of tidbits that are interesting. Those poems are quite interesting, but on the interesting thing is his attitude towards Judaism and the Jewish people. Obviously, there is a question about, and that goes for any Christian author of that period, did he actually interact with actual Jews? And you have this question about especially Tertullian. With Commodianus, we don't exactly know. That would be slightly more likely if he was in Syria. Maybe, we don't know. But on the one hand, he has the kind of classic patristic anti-Jewish rhetoric going back to Justin. Jews are murderers. They are they have hard necks, they reject Jesus, they are blinded. You know the story. On the other hand, he does have the narrative, which again is attested primarily in Jewish sources, about the return of the lost tribes of Israel. Interestingly, those tribes, they live in a sort of paradisiac circumstances beyond Euphrates. They surprisingly, they only eat vegetables. They don't eat anything that contains blood. They don't eat animals, which is an interesting point because we have Epiphanius that speaks about Jewish Christians that actually are vegetarian. Obviously, if you want to believe Epiphanius, but these tribes, they keep the entirety of the law, and Commodianus says, just as we will keep it ourselves. And that's interesting because it seems like he doesn't perceive a discontinuity between the Old Covenant and New Covenant, between what he calls the first law and the second law. He thinks that there is a first law and a second law, but it's not exactly clear that the first law is Torah, Jewish law, halacha, and the second law is simply what Jesus taught. I think he thinks that there is continuity between these two things, and that somehow in the end time, once these Jews actually, and he specifically says these are Jews, these Jews actually liberate Jerusalem, then they will actually, we all will abide by that law. That's quite interesting. We don't have that in many other Christian authors. Actually, Wolfram Kinzig had an article decades ago on the Philosemitismus angesichts des Endes, the philosemitism in the face of the end of the eschaton. I wouldn't call it this. He still is incredibly critical of Jews of his own day, but he is interested in Jews of the end time.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
On this note, I'd like to thank our speaker today. We look very much to his book at the end of the year, and we're glad that we had the chance to hear a bit of it in advance.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much once again, and thank you all for joining.